Certainly there are still human rights problems in South Korea. But I think if we compare them directly with North Korea, it's really night and day. Perhaps the comparison may have been more apt back during the periods of military dictatorship in South Korea, when certainly there was a systematic abuse of human rights by South Korean governments.
That conversation is coming up later in the podcast. From Asia News Weekly, this is Asia Now, the podcast featuring stories and interviews from the Asia-Pacific region. Labor camps, harsh working conditions, and people fleeing for their lives. Those are stories we usually associate with human rights abuses in North Korea. But these are recent events from South Korea. The state of human rights on the Korean peninsula is one conversation taking place in Asia now. Hello everyone, welcome to Asia Now. I'm your host, Steve Miller, and I'd like to thank you for listening and downloading this week's podcast. Last year, the United Nations held formal meetings on alleged human rights abuses in North Korea. Michael Kirby, a former Australian judge, led the UN Commission of Inquiry and gave a very detailed account. According to that Commission of Inquiry, there were wide-ranging abuses, including prison camps, systematic torture, starvation, and killings, and some compared it to Nazi-era atrocities. The report's publication prompted calls among Western states and their allies for punitive action to be taken against North Korea. Subsequently, the Third Committee voted on a measure to refer North Korea and Kim Jong-un to the International Criminal Court to stand trial for crimes against humanity. Now, you can listen to our November 5th edition of Asia Now for an interview with Joanna Hosniak. She's the Deputy Director General of the Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights, and she actually assisted in creating that report. As horrific as the conditions in North Korea sound, the truth is, on the surface, South Korea might not be any better, despite its rosy appearance in K-pop and the drama scene. Last summer, a 23-year-old military conscript was beaten lifeless by others in his same unit. It was a horrific example of how superiors in Korea's top-down hierarchy sometimes treat their subordinates. If we jump forward to the recent Korean air nut rage scandal, Park Chung-jin, the chief steward of that flight, had very harsh words for the airline heiress. He said, quote, "I don't think Cho showed an ounce of conscience, treating powerless people like myself like feudal slaves, forcing us to sacrifice, and treating it as if it was the natural thing to do." End quote. Part-time workers don't fare much better, even when they're working for major U.S. companies. According to a protest in Seoul on February 7th by the Part-Time Workers Union, McDonald's workers in Korea earn a minimum hourly wage of 5,580 won, which is about $5. Thus, those working the maximum 60 hours per month to keep them at a part-time status only earn 334,800 won a month, which is just over $304. Now, going back in time, I made more than that in high school sacking groceries. However, probably the most horrific tale of late from South Korea is one akin to actual slavery. According to a report in the Associated Press, slavery thrives on a certain chain of rural islands in South Korea's rugged southwest coast, nurtured by a long history of exploitation and the demands of trying to squeeze out a living from the sea. In fact, on 5 separate occasions during the past 10 years, stories of salt farmers corralling Korea's disabled and forcing them to work under slave-like conditions have surfaced. Local courts have said such criminal activities were tolerated as common practice by a large number of salt farms nearby, and thus the court suspended prison sentences for 2 farmers. Now, these are horrendous stories, but like everything else in the world, events like these need to be placed in perspective and context. Joining me now on the phone is Phil Robertson, Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch Asia Division, and he's going to do just that. Phil, welcome to Asia Now.
Thanks.
Phil, as it's been widely reported, North Korea has a horrendous human rights record. I was wondering if you could really briefly paint us a picture.
Well, the situation in North Korea is very grave. The human rights situation, as that UN Commission of Inquiry, which was established by the Human Rights Council, found that the abuses there were probably as bad as anywhere in the world. People were harking back to the sort of abuses that were seen during World War II, gulags, concentration camps, the like. And certainly there is a network of labor camps and political prisoner camps that are systematically used to repress and intimidate the people of North Korea. There's a whole range of restrictions on basic rights that most people take for granted. Things like the right to meet with other persons and form a group, or to protest, or to even just speak out and have an opinion that might be going against the government. All those rights are essentially non-existent in North Korea. And so, not surprisingly, when people are given the opportunity to flee the country, they do. And now we're seeing increased restrictions on right to movement and efforts to try to close down that North Korea-China border, where so many North Koreans have fled, and many of them ultimately ended up in Seoul.
If we do take a look at South Korea, how does its record of human rights compare to not only North Korea's, but to its peers in Asia?
Well, certainly there are still human rights problems in South Korea. But I think if we compare them directly with North Korea, it's really night and day. Perhaps the comparison may have been more apt back during the periods of military dictatorship in South Korea, when certainly there was a systematic abuse of human rights by South Korean governments. However, there are still, I would call, hangovers from that period of time. Some of the prosecutions under the national security law, which is a relic of the Cold War, and really very broadly written in a way that can almost penalize any sort of anti-government protest or expression as something that is a threat to national security. And this is being used in an abusive way by the government of President Park. We've spoken out about this. We're very concerned, for instance, recently about the dissolution of the UPP, the political party on the left, which, didn't have that many MPs. It had 5 MPs, but certainly some people in South Korea supported it. And from what we've seen, it shouldn't have been disbanded. It should have been essentially argued with if people felt that it was taking the wrong position. But to accuse it of being traitorous, I think, is a step too far. But North Korea, I think, is still really very much worse than South Korea at this time. We're dealing with in North Korea a country which the UN has now undertaken a special initiative. This is the Commission of Inquiry that was taking place last year, chaired by Justice Kirby from Australia, which did find crimes against humanity. And now the UN General Assembly has voted a resolution by a resounding margin calling on the UN Security Council to ensure accountability for those human rights abuses, including a possible referral of Kim Jong-un and top North Korean leadership to the International Criminal Court. Now, of course, that's probably not going to go forward at this point, because at the UN Security Council, China and Russia would veto that kind of resolution. And without a resolution of the UN Security Council, you can't refer North Korea to the International Criminal Court, because North Korea has not ratified the Rome Statute establishing that court. So the only way to get them there over their objections is with the UN Security Council to do it. But that doesn't mean that North Korea has not now been identified as one of the worst human rights abusing countries in the world. And the government, I think, is under more pressure than it's ever been on human rights issues. And that's, I think, a contrast to a problematic human rights situation in South Korea, but not something that is so far out of the mainstream as North Korea. You asked whether, what was South Korea's comparison on human rights to other parts of the region, both East Asia and Southeast Asia. And I would say that South Korea continues to penalize anti-government speech and protests, but not at a level any more significant than other countries in the region. In fact, there are other countries, for instance, like in Vietnam, which are much worse than South Korea now.
Phil Robertson is Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch's Asia Division. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome. Thanks so much.
As we move forward this year, what changes do you think need to take place to ensure human rights for everyone? I hope you'll share your thoughts in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. Keep up with news from the region by following Asian News Weekly on Facebook and Twitter. You can also send an email to the show with your comments, questions, and feedback. Just drop a line to podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. You can subscribe to this and other podcasts at asiannewsweekly.net or in your favorite podcast application like iTunes or Stitcher. Subscribing is free, and when you do, that next episode is delivered automatically to you. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and if you did, please share with your friends. Thank you so much for listening today. For Asia Now, I'm Steve Miller.